A woman asks for 6 silver coins for a potion that will save her husband, whose back is broken. She only has 2. The hero looks at the vial containing the potion and can see right through it. It was deliberately made defective. 7 ingredients, 4 too many. 15% of the potency it should have. But let's go back. The day before, Daniel Carter woke up face down in sawdust on the floor of an abandoned workshop. Sawdust had filled his nose and mouth. He coughed so hard his ribs cramped. The last thing he remembered was the white light of headlights, the sound of an impact, and a thought about a teapot that he hadn't had time to finish. And now he's breathing someone else's air and doesn't understand how he got here. He props himself up on his elbows and looks around. A cracked workbench, rusty pliers on the wall, a barrel of murky water in the corner. Outside the window, a fiery sunset is burning, and someone on the street is yelling that fish has gone up by 2 kopecks and that it's a ripoff. Kopecks. He understands a foreign language. He stands up, grabbing the workbench to keep from falling, and then it flashes through his mind. Oak, 40 years old. The left side has sagged 2 millimeters from the dampness. 4 fasteners, 2 are loose. The load limit is no more than 80 kilograms. The information comes all at once, like a file that opened on its own. He pulls his hand away. He touches the wood again, the same flash. He sees right through the workbench, every fiber, every crack, every point of stress. It's impossible, but it works. He grabs the shard of a knife from the table. Steel, carbon content 0.4, overheated during forging, a micro crack at the tang. 12 strikes and the knife will fall apart. The handle is held together by a promise. Who on earth made this? He picks up a glass vial from the floor. 7 ingredients, 4 too many, 15% of the required strength. In his world, you'd get fined for that. Daniel was an engineer. For 6 years, he'd fought against companies that designed washing machines to break down right after the warranty expired, so people would have to pay again. And now he's standing in another world and sees the exact same problem. Only here, it's lanterns and knives and potions. He steps outside to figure out where he's ended up. Stone houses, tile roofs, lanterns on poles, but without electricity. Inside each one, a dim greenish stone glows. He touches the base of a lantern and freezes. The crystal's mounting is shoddy. There's no insulation. 60% energy loss. Throw it away in 3 weeks and buy a new one. 60%. This isn't just shoddy workmanship. It's the system. Someone is deliberately making things so they break down quickly. He knows this scheme by heart. He returns to the workshop and collapses onto the floor because there's nowhere else to lie down. Numbers and diagrams swirl in his head. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know how he got here. He doesn't know if he can go back. But he already knows one thing. Everything here is done wrong, and that drives him crazy. Morning brings hunger pangs. He hasn't eaten in over a day. In the corner, he finds a sack of grain infested with bugs. He picks the bugs out with his fingers and gnaws on the raw grains. His teeth ache. He needs water and fire, but spores of something disgusting are floating in the barrel. He heads out to the market. Kronheim is noisy and reeks of manure. Carts creak. Guards in dull chainmail stand at the crossroads, and every object he touches screams the same thing at him. I was made badly. I was made to break. I was made so you'd pay again. The smell of pastries hits his nose, and his stomach clenches into a knot. He has no money, not a single copper coin. Hungry and penniless in a foreign world, his only wealth is his ability to see just how shoddily everything here is made. And this is where things get interesting. Near the tavern, he stumbles upon that very woman. Her face is flushed. Her hands are covered in flour. She shouts after a man in a blue cloak with a silver clasp. 6 silver coins for a vial of healing potion. She only has 2. Her husband fell off the roof and is lying there with a broken back. Without the potion, he won't be able to get up. The man doesn't even turn around. He adjusts his clasp and walks away. The woman watches him go, then turns and heads inside. and Daniel stands there, thinking about the vial from the workshop. 7 ingredients, 4 are extra, 15% potency. If he discards the excess and increases the concentration of the necessary ingredient, if he finds the right proportions, he can make the same potion. Cheaper, easier, using ingredients that grow in any garden. He walks into the tavern. Inside, it was cramped and stuffy. 5 tables, benches instead of chairs. The floor was covered in spit. It smelled of grease and sour beer. Behind the counter stood that same woman, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. Next to her were 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl about 5. The boy was silently picking at a bowl of porridge. The girl was clinging to her mother's side. Daniel walked up to the counter. The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were red. Her face was angry. She said that if he'd come for a drink, she only had beer, and it was sour. Daniel said he'd like a bowl of soup on credit. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said she didn't give anything on credit. Then she looked at his face again and said, "All right, 1 bowl." She set a plate of thick broth and a piece of bread in front of him. Daniel ate slowly. The broth was hot and salty, and it was the best meal of his life. Or in his new life. He wasn't sure how to count it. As he ate, he listened. The tavern was simply called The Hall. The woman's name was Maggie Hall. Her husband was a carpenter. 3 days ago, he'd fallen from the roof of a house he was repairing on commission. His back. Something with his spine. He was lying upstairs and couldn't move. The healing potion from the Alchemists Guild cost 6 silver coins. A guard's monthly salary was 2 silver coins. Maggie earned 3 silver coins from the tavern in a good month. She had 2 saved up. She was 4 short. Without the potion, her husband might be bedridden forever. Daniel finished his soup. Then he asked if she had any dried St. John's wort in the kitchen. Maggie looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she said there was a bundle in the pantry. She dried it to keep the flies away. Daniel asked about plantain. She had some. It grew behind the back wall, right in the mud. River moss. Maggie thought for a moment. Then she said the kids had brought some back from the riverbank last week. It should be in the bucket by the door. Daniel asked her to show him the kitchen. Maggie crossed her arms over her chest. She said she didn't know him. Didn't know where he was from. Didn't know why he wanted her herbs. And if he was a sorcerer, he should get lost, because she had enough problems without sorcerers. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said he wasn't a sorcerer. He just knew how to work with materials, and that he could try to do something to make things easier for her husband. Not for money, just for that bowl of soup. Maggie stared at him for another 10 seconds or so. Then she turned and went into the kitchen. He followed her. The kitchen was small. A hearth with a cast-iron stove. Shelves lined with pots. In the corner, sacks of flour and grains. Daniel began by touching each ingredient. St. John's wort, dried, about 4 months old. 70% of the active ingredients remain. Suitable. Plantain, fresh, dirty, needs to be rinsed and squeezed dry. High potency, perfect. River moss, damp, from cold water. 90% active. Daniel had never brewed potions in his life, but when he held the ingredients in his hands, he could see their internal structure. He could see how the molecules of one reacted with the molecules of another. He could see where to heat and where to cool. He saw the proportions the way an engineer sees tolerances, not by eye, but based on data. He asked Maggie for a cauldron and a measuring mug. The cauldron was cast iron. The walls were of uneven thickness. The heat distribution would be uneven, but it would do for a first attempt. He worked for 5 hours. Maggie stood by his side for the first hour. Then she left to tend to the tavern. Then she came back. Then she left again. The children peeked in from behind the door. Daniel rinsed the plantain 3 times. He ground the St. John's wort in a mortar until it was a fine powder. He soaked the moss in lukewarm water for exactly 20 minutes, not 19, not 21, 20. Then he combined everything in the cauldron. He heated it to a certain temperature. He didn't know the degrees on this world's scale, but he could sense the moment when the liquid began to change its structure, like dough that starts to set. He took it off the heat. He stirred it. He let it cool. He heated it again, but more gently. He added more plantain. Let it cool again. By evening, the pot contained a cloudy, greenish liquid. Daniel poured it into a clean glass he found on the shelf. He took the glass and analyzed it. The healing effect was about 65% that of a guild potion. Not ideal, but enough to kickstart the recovery process. Cost: 8 copper coins. For the herbs in the kitchen that were drying out from the flies anyway. 6 silver coins. 8 copper coins. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. Maggie was walking ahead of him. A man was lying in the small room under the sloping roof. He was burly, with light brown hair. His face was ashen with pain. He was lying on his back and didn't move. Maggie told him that this man had made something in the kitchen and said it would help. The man looked at Daniel. His eyes were clouded with pain. He asked who he was. Daniel said he was nobody, just a passerby. He asked the man to open his mouth. The man opened it. Daniel poured the potion into his mouth with a spoon, slowly, down his throat. The man grimaced. He said it tasted bitter. Daniel said it was supposed to taste bitter. That meant it was working. He didn't know if it was working. An hour later, the man said his back felt warmer. 3 hours later, he wiggled his toes. By morning, he was sitting up in bed. Maggie stood in the doorway, looking at her husband, then at Daniel, then back at her husband. Then she went downstairs and came back with a plate of porridge, a piece of meat, and a mug of beer. She set them down in front of Daniel. She said the debt for the soup was settled, and that he'd be eating at her place until he'd eaten his fill because he looked terrible. Daniel ate the porridge and thought. 8 copper coins, 6 silver coins. The difference in cost is enormous. And the difference in effectiveness is 1.5 times. If I improve the proportions, if I find better ingredients, if I choose the right cookware, I could bring the effectiveness up to 80% of the guild standard for a cost of 10 copper coins. A week later, there was a line at the back door of Maggie Hall's tavern. 10 people, then 15, then 20. Anna the laundress, whose hands were eaten away by lye. Old Thomas, whose back wouldn't straighten. A mother with a child whose cough hadn't gone away for 3 weeks. Daniel saw each one. He asked what was hurting. He asked how long it had been going on. He felt their arm or back or forehead. He jotted it down in a notebook he'd bound together from scraps of paper found in his workshop. He made a separate remedy for each person. No one-size-fits-all potion. For Anna the laundress, he added an ingredient to the base formula that reduced inflammation and protected the skin. For old Thomas, he increased the proportion of St. John's wort because his pain was chronic and a cumulative effect was needed. For the child with a cough, he removed the St. John's wort entirely and replaced it with wild thyme because a child's body reacts differently. Each potion cost between 6 and 12 copper coins. People paid, thanked him, and left, then returned with their neighbors the next day. Maggie counted the money every evening. In the first week, Daniel earned 42 kopecks. It was enough to pay her back for the food. It was enough to buy decent clothes. It was enough to pay for a room in the attic. He lay on a narrow bed beneath the sloping roof and stared at the ceiling. He was in a strange world, without papers, without a past, without understanding what had happened. But he had his hands, and his head, and the ability to see things as they really were. A spider sat on the ceiling, spinning its web. Daniel looked at it and thought that the spider was an engineer too. In the third week, Daniel rented an abandoned workshop, the very one where he'd woken up. The landlord was an old man named Bernard, and he asked for 1 silver coin a month. Daniel paid him with the money he'd earned selling potions. The workshop was in poor condition. The roof was leaking in 2 places. One wall was damp and had started to grow mold. The workbench was wobbly. The windows had no glass. But the walls were thick and made of stone, and there was a drain in the floor, which meant that people had once worked here in earnest. Daniel spent 3 days making repairs. He patched the roof with scraps of tile he found in a dump outside the city wall. He checked each piece for strength and selected only those that would withstand the winter. He patched the wall with a mixture of clay, ash, and river sand. His intuition guided the proportions, exactly the right mixture so it wouldn't crack as it dried. He reinforced the workbench. He made 2 new fasteners from wooden wedges and a scrap of iron strip he'd found in a pile of rubble. The strip was rusty, but the core was sound. He cleaned it up and cut it to size. He covered the windows with oiled cloth. It wasn't glass, but it let in light and kept the wind out. By the end of the 3rd day, the workshop looked like a workshop, not like an abandoned shed. And on that day, Emma Wright arrived. She stood at the door, hesitating for about 5 minutes before knocking. Thin, very thin. Her dark hair was tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. On her nose were glasses with thick lenses that she had clearly ground herself because the lenses were uneven. Her fingers were stained with chemicals, yellow, brown, and green. She said she'd heard about him at the market, that he made potions that actually worked, and that he charged 8 copper coins for what the guild sold for 6 silver coins. Daniel confirmed it. She asked if she could watch him work. Daniel asked why. She hesitated. Then she said she'd been expelled from the Alchemists Guild 4 months ago, for asking questions. Daniel asked what kind of questions. She said she'd asked the master why they added sage to a healing potion if sage neutralizes the active ingredient. The master said that's what the recipe says. She said there was a mistake in the recipe. The master said the recipe was 300 years old and couldn't possibly contain a mistake. She said that the age of the recipe doesn't make a mistake right. She was expelled the very next day, barred from working in any guild in the city. For 4 months she lived on the streets and scraped by washing floors in taverns. Daniel listened and said nothing. Then he walked over to the shelf. He picked up a vial of the healing potion he'd brewed yesterday. He handed it to her. He told her she was right about the sage. It wasn't in the correct recipe. Emma took the vial. Her hands were shaking. She opened the stopper and sniffed it. Then she closed it and looked at him. Her eyes were shining. She said she wanted to work with him for food and a roof over her head. Money later. Daniel said the money had to be paid up front, 2 silver coins a month. It wasn't much, but it was fair. She nodded so quickly that her glasses slid down to the tip of her nose. With Emma, everything changed. She knew alchemy. Not the way Daniel did. He could see right through the materials but didn't know the local names. He didn't know where things grew. He didn't know the seasonal cycles of the herbs. He didn't know that river moss from the north bank was 3 times more potent than that from the south because the north bank was closer to the ether vein. Emma knew. She knew all of Velaroom's herbs by name and property. She knew the map of suppliers. She knew which ingredients could be found at the market and which required a trip to the suburbs. She was a walking encyclopedia whom the guild had expelled because the encyclopedia had dared to point out a typo. Together, in a week, they expanded their line of potions from 1 to 3. Basic healing potion, enhanced healing potion, and a painkiller for chronic pain sufferers. But Daniel didn't stop at potions. By the 4th week, he had started making knives. The idea was simple. Every day, he saw how people in Kronheim struggled with their tools. The butcher at the market chopped up a carcass with a knife that went dull after 10 strokes. The tanner cut hides with a blade that wobbled in its handle. The shoemaker pricked with an awl that bent under pressure. All of this was produced by the Blacksmith Sorcerers Guild. All of this was expensive. All of it was made so that a month later, the customer would come back for a new one. Daniel bought 3 fragments of old blades at the market, for next to nothing. No one bought broken items because the Blacksmiths Guild didn't repair them. If it broke, you threw it away and paid for a new one. He took the fragments to his workshop. He laid them out on the workbench. He touched each one. The first, good steel, enough carbon. It broke along a line of poor hardening. The core is intact. The second, worse steel, lots of impurities. But if he remelted and purified it, there'd be enough for 2 small blades. The third, junk, good only for nails. He didn't have a forge, he didn't have a furnace, no anvil, but in the corner of the workshop stood an old hearth. and Daniel knew the temperatures. He knew at what temperature steel becomes soft. He knew at what temperature it hardens. He knew when to strike and when to wait. He built the simplest of furnaces out of bricks and clay in half a day. Not perfect, but it worked. He made the bellows from a bull's bladder and 2 wooden slats. There was enough air to raise the temperature to the right level. He worked on his first knife for 3 days. He reforged the scrap. He straightened the blade. He made the tang long and thick so that the handle would be held in place not by glue but by its structure. The handle was made of ash, dense wood, grain running along the axis, 3 rivets, each one fitted perfectly. The knife fit his hand like a glove. The blade held its edge. He tested it, 100 strikes against an oak block. Not a single snag. A guild knife would dull after 10. He made 4 knives in 2 weeks, a butcher's knife, a kitchen knife, a shoemaker's knife, and a small utility knife, each tailored to a specific hand. The butcher's knife was for Olaf, the butcher from the market. Daniel had seen him at work. Right-handed, a power grip, a wide palm. The knife had to be heavy at the front with a thick heel. The kitchen knife was for Maggie. She chopped vegetables quickly and finely. A light knife, a thin blade, a handle suited for a small hand. Olaf came to pick up the knife and tested it on a piece of meat. He chopped once. He looked at the cut. He chopped again. Then he looked at Daniel and asked how much it cost. Daniel said 1 silver coin. Olaf said that a guild knife cost 4 and would get dull in a week. Then he fell silent. Then he took out a coin and placed it on the workbench. Then he asked if he could order 2 more for the apprentices. By the end of the 5th week, Daniel had a lineup of 3 potions and 4 knives. The workshop ran from dawn to dusk. Emma brewed potions. Daniel forged and assembled. Maggie kept the books and took orders at the tavern. Money was coming in, not much, but steadily. And every evening, Daniel would sit down at his workbench and draw blueprints. The next step, lamps. He'd seen the street lamps. He'd seen how the crystals inside them burned out in 3 weeks. He'd seen people buying new ones from the Enchanters Guild for 2 silver pieces. And he saw the solution. As simple as all genius ideas. A replaceable cartridge. Don't throw away the lamp, replace the crystal. Just like a light bulb. He sketched and calculated and recalculated, his head buzzing, and by midnight blood started flowing from his nose. He wiped the blood away with his sleeve and continued sketching. By morning, the design was ready. The lamp was simple. That was the whole idea. A tin casing, inside a socket for the crystal. A threaded socket. The crystal is inserted and secured with a quarter turn. Burned out. He unscrewed it. Inserted a new one. That was it. No one in Valarum had ever done it this way before. Because the Enchanters Guild sold lamps as complete units, the crystal was soldered permanently into the casing. When it burned out after 3 weeks, you'd throw away the whole lamp and buy a new one for 2 silver coins. Daniel spent 3 days on the prototype. He bought the metal at the market from a junk dealer, scraps from something large. He carved out the socket on his workbench with a file. He cut the threads by hand with a tap he'd made himself from a steel rod. That was the hardest part. The thread had to be even with consistent pitch. Otherwise, the crystal would rattle loose and lose contact with the housing. He messed up the first 2 sockets. The third one worked. He bought the crystal from a small vendor at the market, the cheapest one available, a fragment of something much larger, for 3 copper coins. He inserted the crystal into the socket. He turned it a quarter turn. The crystal flashed to life. The light was even and warm, not greenish like city streetlights. Warm. Because Daniel had chosen the thickness of the tin screen to cut off the cold part of the spectrum. He didn't know what it was called in the terminology of this world, but he knew the wavelengths. And he knew that the human eye responds better to warm light in the evening. Engineering nerdiness in its purest form. But the lamp glowed beautifully. He took it to Maggie. He set it on the counter in the tavern. Maggie looked at the lamp, then at Daniel, then back at the lamp. She said the light was nice. Daniel said that when the crystal went out, you had to twist it like this, pull it out, and insert a new one. A new crystal costs 3 copper coins. Not 2 silver coins for the whole lamp. 3 copper coins for a crystal. Maggie was silent. Then she said he was crazy. Then she said she needed 5 of them, for the whole tavern. The patrons saw the lamp. The next day, Maggie's neighbor came by and asked if he could buy one just like it. Then Anna, the laundress, came. Then Olaf, the butcher. Daniel made 2 lamps a day. That was his limit. Each socket had to be hand-carved. Each body had to be custom-fitted. He worked 14 hours a day, and by evening his hands were shaking and his temples were throbbing. A week later, he had 20 orders and couldn't fulfill them. He needed help. But not just any help. He needed someone who knew how to work with metal. The answer came on its own, or rather, she came on her own. Lieutenant Sarah Finch, former lieutenant. She came to the workshop in the 6th week, tall, short dark hair, straight back, a stern face. Her left arm ended just below the wrist. The stump was bandaged with clean cloth. She brought a sword, an issue sword, a guard's sword. She said the blade had come loose in the hilt and that the Blacksmiths Guild was asking for 1.5 silver coins for the repair. She didn't have 1.5 silver coins. She had almost nothing at all. A guard's disability pension is 5 copper coins a month. She asked him to repair the sword. Daniel took the sword. Standard guard steel. Not bad. The blade is fine. The problem was with the tang. The rivet holding the hilt in place had come loose. 10 minutes work. He repaired it right in front of her. He knocked out the old rivet, put in a new one, tightened it, checked it. It held. He handed it back to her. He told her it was free. Because it took 10 minutes, not 1.5 silver coins. Sarah took the sword. She checked the grip, swung it with her wrist, nodded. Then she looked at her left hand, or rather what was left of it, and said that the Artifact Guild charges 12 gold pieces for a prosthesis. That was her 10-year pension. She asked if he could do it. She fell silent. Daniel looked at the stump. He asked for permission. She nodded. He touched it. The bone had healed well. The muscles in the forearm were fine. There were nerve endings. The ligaments were intact up to a certain point. It was workable. He said he could try. He wouldn't promise anything, but he'd try. She asked how much it would cost. He said they'd discuss it later. First, he had to make it. The prosthesis became his most challenging project. He worked on it for 2 weeks alongside the lamps and potions. During the day, he made lamps and took orders. At night, he drew up blueprints for the prosthesis. The problem was the attachment. Sarah's stump was long. Her forearm muscles were intact. This meant that when she tensed her muscles, the shape of the stump would change. If the attachment was rigid, it would press against her when she tensed and chafe when she relaxed. She needed an attachment that could adjust. He devised a system consisting of a leather sleeve with movable plates. The plates were made of thin steel and mounted on hinges. When the muscles contracted, they pushed the plates apart, distributing the pressure evenly. When the muscles relaxed, springs returned the plates to their original position, and the attachment hugged the stump tightly. He made the hand out of wood and steel. The 5 fingers are hinged, not each one separately, but in 2 groups. The thumb is separate, the other 4 are together. It's a clamping grip. Pull the cable on the back and the fingers clench. Let go and they open. The cable is controlled by the movement of the forearm. He tensed his muscle and the hand clenched. He relaxed and it opened. It was crude, very crude by the standards of his former world. But for a world where a prosthesis was a wooden stick with a hook, it was a miracle. He made 3 interchangeable hands. The first was for everyday use, with movable fingers, for eating, dressing, and simple tasks. The second was for combat. Instead of fingers, it had a steel clamp that held the hilt of a sword or shield firmly in place. Not pretty, but reliable. The third was for precision work, narrow fingers with soft pads, for writing, for working with mechanisms, for anything that requires precision. All 3 attached to the same sleeve. A click and they were swapped out. 4 seconds. He called Sarah into the workshop. She came in. She saw the 3 brushes laid out in a row on the workbench. She looked at them, then at Daniel. He slipped the sleeve onto her hand, tightened the fastener, asked her to tense her hand. The plates shifted. The sleeve fit snugly but without pressure. Then he inserted the first brush, the everyday one. It clicked into place. He asked her to tense her muscle as if she were clenching her fist. Her fingers clenched. She looked at her hand, her new hand. She clenched and unclenched it, clenched and unclenched. Then he showed her the second one, the combat hand. She inserted the sword into the clamp. She gave it a twist. The sword held fast. Then the third one, for delicate work. She picked up a pen from the table. She drew a line on the paper, a crooked one, unsteady, but a line. She stood in the middle of the workshop, holding a quill in a hand that hadn't been there a month ago. She was silent. Emma sat in the corner, biting her lip. Maggie stood in the doorway with the kids. Daniel said the mount would need a couple more days of fine-tuning, and that the grip could be improved, and that the cable needed to be lubricated once a week. Sarah told him to shut up. Then she said she needed a job. Daniel said he needed a security chief, because the guilds would be coming to see him soon, and he'd need someone who knew how to stand in the doorway without blinking. Sarah didn't smile, but she nodded. The guild's first visit took place the following week. A man from the guild arrived on Wednesday morning. Short, round, a shiny bald spot, a cloak with silver trim, the emblem of the Enchanters Guild on his chest. He walked into the workshop as if he were entering his own home. No knock, no greeting. He looked around. He touched the lamp on the table. He touched the vial of potion. Then he looked at Daniel and smiled. The smile was oily. He said his name was Arnold Fetter, and that he was a representative of the Council of the 7 Guilds on matters of craftsmanship, and that Master Carter was conducting business without a guild license, which in itself constituted a violation of paragraph 16 of the Kronheim Craftsmanship Code. Daniel asked what a guild license was. Fetter explained that to sell any product in the city, one must be a member of one of the 7 guilds or hold a license from a guild. The license costs 20 gold pieces a year. Membership is free, but there is an initiation fee of 10 gold pieces and a 3-year apprenticeship. Daniel asked what would happen if he didn't join or buy a license. Fetter said that in that case, he would be declared a heretic of the craft, his goods would be confiscated, and his workshop would be shut down. Daniel was silent. 20 gold pieces. He earned 2 silver pieces a week. 20 gold pieces is equal to 200 silver pieces. 20 gold pieces is 400 silver pieces. That's 4 years of work without food or sleep. Fetter looked at him and smiled. Then he said there was another option. The council is prepared to offer Master Carter special terms. 300 gold pieces in a lump sum, in exchange for the full buyout of his recipes and blueprints, and a commitment to cease independent operations. 300 gold pieces. Daniel did the math in his head. That's 6,000 silver pieces. He could buy a house. He could live comfortably for several years. He could leave town and never return. Fetter handed him a piece of paper, a contract. Daniel took the paper and read it. Sarah stood by the door, staring at Fetter without blinking. Emma froze by the shelf of potions. Daniel finished reading the contract. He placed it on the table. He said, "No." Fetter stopped smiling. He asked why. Daniel said that the contract contained a clause transferring ownership of all future developments to the council. Everything he came up with after signing would no longer belong to him. And there was also a non-disclosure clause. He wouldn't be able to teach anyone what he knew. And there was a clause regarding his place of residence. He was required to remain in Kronheim and not leave the city without the council's permission. This isn't about buying recipes. It's about buying him. Fetter said the terms were negotiable. Daniel said he wasn't interested in the terms. He would work, he would sell, and he would do it without their patent. Because nowhere in any paragraph does it say that treating people is a privilege rather than a right. Fetter stood up. The smile returned, but it was different. Cold. He said that the council regretted Master Carter's decision, and that the further consequences would rest entirely on his conscience. Then he left. Sarah closed the door behind him. She looked at Daniel. She said that he had just declared war on people who had more money than the entire lower city combined. Daniel said he was aware of that. Then he sat down at the workbench and began working. 3 days later, the inspectors arrived, 2 guards and an official from the city council. The official said a complaint had been filed regarding illegal trade and that he had been instructed to inspect the workshop and inventory the goods for confiscation. Sarah stood between him and the workbench. The official looked at her prosthetic, at her steel hand, at the sword on her belt. He swallowed hard. Daniel said they could inspect the workshop. He didn't object, but he wanted the official to explain exactly which law he intended to use to confiscate the medicinal herbs. Because the potions in his workshop were herbal tinctures, herbs were not a regulated commodity under the Alchemists Guild. Only products based on arcane crystals are subject to regulation, and there isn't a single crystal in his potions. The official paused. He rummaged through his papers. He leafed through them for a long time. Daniel waited. He wasn't bluffing. He'd spent 2 evenings at the city library, paid access, 2 copper coins an hour. He'd read the entire Kronheim Craft Codex, all 412 pages, and he'd found a loophole. The guild's monopoly applied to items containing a magical component, an arcane crystal. His potions were purely herbal, no magic involved. Technically, they weren't potions, but tinctures, and tinctures didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the Alchemists Guild. Knives were a more complicated matter. Knives involved metalworking, and metalworking fell under the Blacksmiths Guild. But he found another loophole. The law prohibited production and sale, but it didn't prohibit repair. Technically, Daniel wasn't making new knives. He was reforging old ones, repairing them. And repairing someone else's property didn't require a guild license. A minor legal loophole, but enough to slip through. The official read the papers. He flipped through them. He read. Then he closed the folder. He looked at the guards. The guards were looking at the lamp that cast a warm, even light on the table. One of them quietly asked how much one like that cost. The official said that the inspection had revealed no violations and that he would draw up a report. Then he left. The guard lingered by the door. He looked at the lamp once more, then at Daniel. Daniel said that the lamp cost 1 silver coin and the replacement crystal cost 3 copper coins. The guard nodded and left. The next day, he returned, without his uniform, accompanied by his wife. He bought 2 lamps. It was a small victory, but Daniel knew that small victories didn't win the war. The guilds had backed down because they hadn't expected legal resistance. But they'll be back, with different arguments. In the 7th week, Lily Bennett showed up at the workshop. Daniel found her behind the trash can behind the workshop. She was trying to pull a loaf of bread, which Maggie had brought that morning, out through the window. 12 years old, skinny as a stick, dirty. Her hair was matted. She wore a burlap dress. Her feet were wrapped in rags. Daniel grabbed her by the collar just as she was about to climb through the window. She struggled, scratched, and bit. Then she grew tired. She looked up at him from under her brows. He asked her name. She said it was none of his business. He asked when she'd last eaten. She didn't say anything. He let her go. He went inside. He came back with a bowl of porridge and some bread. He set it on the ground in front of her. She looked at the food, then at him, then at the food. Then she grabbed the bowl and ate so fast she choked. Daniel sat down next to her on a crate. He waited. She finished eating. She licked the bowl clean. Then she said her name was Lily. 2 days later, she was sitting in the workshop on an upside-down bucket, telling Daniel everything she knew about Kronheim. She knew a lot. Which guard takes bribes? Which merchant shortchanges customers? Where Magister Grave lived? How many guards were at the Alchemists Guild warehouse? What time the guard shift changed at the North Gate? Where the herbs were brought from on Thursdays? She knew the city like the back of her hand, because the city was her home. 3 years on the streets, since she was 10. Her parents had died in an epidemic. The shelter kicked her out after 6 months. After that, she was on her own. Daniel listened and took notes, not because he was planning to spy, but because he needed a map. A map of the city. A map of the people. A map of suppliers. A map of threats. Lily gave him all of that, in exchange for food, a roof over her head, and a bucket in the corner she could sit on. A week later, she brought 2 boys, street kids just like her. Daniel fed them too. They became couriers. They delivered orders to customers. They delivered notes from Maggie. They delivered weed from suppliers. Fast, discreet, knowing every alleyway. Daniel entered Lily's name in the workshop's registry as an apprentice, with a salary of 10 copper coins a month, with the right to vote at the evening meetings where they discussed business. He gave her a document, a piece of paper with a seal he'd carved himself from a scrap of wood. Not the guild seal, his own. A circle with a hammer and a gear. Lily took the paper. She read it, slowly, syllable by syllable. Then she folded it and tucked it into her bosom. Then she went into a corner and sat there quietly for about 20 minutes. Mom said later that she'd seen Lily crying, but Lily denied it. The workshop was growing. Slowly, but it was growing. Potions, knives, lamps. 6 permanent employees, counting Lily and the boys. 20 regular customers. A reputation that was spreading through the lower city like oil on water. And Daniel knew that every day of this growth was yet another reason for the guilds to strike harder. In the 8th week, Daniel hung up his sign, a simple ash wood board, the letters burned into it with a red-hot nail. Carter, we repair and make. Emma said the name was too simple. Daniel said the name had to be one that even an illiterate person could remember on the first try. Maggie said she liked it. Sarah said she didn't care either way. Lily said the boys at the market were already calling him Master Chinin. That was even better. On the first day after the sign went up, 14 customers came in. On the second, 20. By the third, Daniel had stopped counting. The line stretched from the workshop door all the way to the corner of the street. People came in the morning and waited for hours. They brought everything: broken locks, leaky pots, cracked axes, torn boots, and fogged-up mirrors. Daniel couldn't fix most of it because he didn't have the materials or tools. But he picked up every item. He examined each one, and he explained to each owner what was broken and why. To Griff, the shoemaker, he said that his knife from the Blacksmiths Guild had been tempered unevenly and that the blade would always dull faster on the right side. To Anna, the laundress, he showed that her washing kettle had a crack at the bottom that wasn't leaking yet but would start leaking in a month, and that if he filled it with tin now, the cauldron would last another 2 years. To Olaf, the butcher, he explained that the hooks on which he hung the carcasses were made of soft, unhardened iron and that they would bend under the weight in winter when the meat was heavier. People listened. They nodded. Some were angry, but not at Daniel, at those who had sold them these things. Some said nothing and walked away, but they came back. They always came back, because no one had ever explained to them before that they were being cheated. They simply thought that things broke because that's just the way the world works. Daniel worked 7 days a week, from dawn until late at night. Emma brewed potions in the back room. 3 kinds: a basic healing potion for cuts and bruises, a stronger one for fractures and inflammation, a pain-relieving for chronic pain. She'd learned to make them on her own without his supervision. He checked every batch. He touched every vial. He checked the ingredients. Emma rarely made mistakes, and with each passing week, even less so. Sarah handled security and logistics. Lily's 2 boys worked as couriers. Maggie took orders at the tavern, which had become their unofficial reception point. The money was coming in, not quickly, but steadily. 2 silver coins a week turned into 4, then 6. Daniel paid everyone. Emma 2 silver coins a month, Sarah got 2.5, Lily got 10 copper coins. The boys got 5 each. Maggie received a percentage of the orders taken through the tavern. The rest went toward materials, rent, and what Daniel privately called his rainy day fund. Because a rainy day would come. He knew that. In the 10th week, Daniel made his most important invention of the first period. He was already selling the lamp with a replaceable crystal, but the crystals in it burned out in 3 weeks, just like the ones in the guild's lamps. The only difference was that a replacement cost 3 copper coins instead of 2 silver ones. Cheaper, but not ideal. Daniel wanted the crystal to last longer. He took the crystal and held it in his hands for half an hour. He just held it and looked inside. The structure of the arcane crystal was more complex than he'd thought. A crystal lattice with energy inside. The energy flowed along the facets. When the crystal was inserted into the lamp, it began to release energy through the contact point. The point was small. The flow through it was strong, like water through a narrow pipe. The pressure was high. The crystal burned out from its own current. The Enchanters Guild knew this and did nothing about it. Because the faster it burned out, the more often people bought it. Daniel saw a solution. He needed to increase the contact area. Not just 1 point, but 3 or 4. Distribute the current evenly. The pressure drops. The crystal lasts longer. He redesigned the socket. Instead of a single contact pin, he made 4. He arranged them evenly around the circumference. Each one barely touches the crystal's face. The flow is divided into 4. The pressure on each point drops 4-fold. The crystal should last not 3 weeks, but 3 months. He inserted the crystal into the new socket. The lamp lit up. The light was slightly dimmer than in the old version, because the current was slower. But it was more than enough for the house. He timed it. After 3 weeks, the crystal was still glowing. After a month, it was still glowing. After 6 weeks, it began to dim. After 7, it went out. 7 weeks. Not 3. More than twice as long. He knew it could last up to 3 months if he found a higher quality crystal. But even 7 weeks was a revolution. 3 copper coins every 7 weeks instead of 2 silver coins every 3 weeks. The city was going crazy. Everyone in the lower city knew the name Carter's Lamp. Even in the upper city, where the nobility and wealthy merchants lived, people were starting to talk. Not to buy yet, just to talk. But Daniel knew that talk was the beginning. In the 11th week, 2 things happened. First, a girl he'd never seen before came to him. Petite, black-haired, dark-skinned, narrow eyes. A smile so polite it was almost cloying. She introduced herself, Ha-In Sun, the daughter of a merchant from the eastern lands. She said she'd heard about his lamps, and his potions, and his knives, and that she had a proposal. She knew herb suppliers in 4 provinces. She knew miners who extracted arcane crystals in the foothills. She knew the river routes along which goods could be transported more cheaply than by road. She offered her services as a buyer. Daniel asked why she wanted to do this. She said her father had gone bankrupt 3 years ago. He'd come from across the sea with his goods. The Herbalists Guild had taken over his contracts. They'd crushed him with their prices. Her father lost everything. Then he fell ill. Then he died. She was left alone in a strange city with a contact notebook and her stubbornness. For 3 years, she scrubbed floors, delivered food, and slept wherever she could. And all that time, she never threw away the address book, because it contained the names of people who could sell anything to anyone, bypassing any guild. Daniel asked to see the book. Ha-Un was silent for 3 seconds. Then she pulled a thin, leather-bound notebook from her bosom. She held it out. Daniel opened it. Hieroglyphs. He couldn't read a single line. He looked at her. She smiled. She said she'd translate whatever was needed, but the book would remain with her. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he offered 2 silver coins a month plus 5% of every deal she closed. Ha-In said 3 silver coins and 7%. Daniel said 2.5 and 6. Ha-In smiled. She said, "It's a deal." The second incident. That same evening, a man in a dark cloak entered the workshop. His face was hidden. His hood was pulled down. Sarah stepped toward him, her hand on her sword. The man stopped. He raised his hands. Then he pulled back his hood. He was young, about 30 years old, light brown hair, clean-shaven, expensively dressed under his cloak. A silver chain around his neck with a seal. He introduced himself. Caspian Voigt, assistant to the Crown Governor. He said the governor had taken an interest in Master Carter's activities, not like the guilds, differently. The governor is young and ambitious. He needs taxes. The guilds pay a nominal fee under an ancient privilege. They are very rich and contribute very little to the treasury. The Crown Governor is looking for leverage. Carter could become that leverage. If his business grows enough that the guilds start losing money, they'll be more willing to compromise in negotiations with the Crown. Caspian offered unofficial protection. The governor would turn a blind eye to the lack of a license. The city guard would leave the workshop alone. In exchange, Daniel would sell a portion of his goods at a special price to meet the garrison's needs. Potions for wounded guards, knives for the barracks, lamps for the watchtowers. Daniel thought it over. He knew it was a trap, not a direct one, a cunning one. The governor doesn't want to help him. The governor wants to use him as a club against the guilds. And when the club breaks, the governor will find himself a new one. But the club has no other choice right now. Without the guild's protection, they'll crush him within a month. With their protection, he gains time. Time to grow, to become too big to be crushed. He said yes. Caspian nodded. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. The deputy governor's hand was cold and dry. He left as quietly as he had come. Sarah stood by the door and watched him go. Then she said that Daniel had just gone to bed with a snake. Daniel said he knew, but the floor was even colder. The third month began with fire. Daniel woke up to Sarah's scream. She had been sleeping in the workshop on a cot by the door, a guard's habit, sleeping by the entrance. The scream was short and sharp. One word. "We're on fire!" Daniel slid down the ladder from the attic. The back wall of the workshop was ablaze. Someone had splashed oil on the outside and set it alight. The flame spread quickly through the dry wood. The smoke stung his eyes and filled his lungs. Emma was inside. She was asleep in the back room where she brewed potions. Daniel rushed toward her. The back room door was jammed shut by the heat. He rammed it with his shoulder. Once, twice, 3 times. The door wouldn't budge. Sarah came over and struck the doorframe with her steel hand. The wood cracked. The door swung open. Emma was sitting on the floor, coughing. Her eyes were closed. Her glasses were in her hand. Daniel picked her up. She was light. Too light. He carried her outside. Sarah put out the fire. All by herself. A barrel of water stood against the wall. She scooped it up with a bucket and poured it out. With one hand. Her prosthetic. The steel hand wasn't afraid of fire. Neighbors came running. Olaf the butcher. Griff the shoemaker. 2 workers from the weaving mill around the corner. They helped carry water. An hour later, the fire was extinguished. The back wall had burned completely through. Emma's storeroom was destroyed. All her potion supplies. 3 weeks' worth of work. 60 vials. Her herbs. Her tools. Everything. The ceiling over the back of the workshop had collapsed. The workbench had survived. The lamps were intact. The knives were intact. The front part of the workshop was still standing, but a third of it was gone. Daniel sat on a rock across from the workshop, staring at the smoldering wall. Emma sat beside him. She was silent. She was coughing. Sarah stood there, examining the spot where the fire had started. Then she bent down and picked up a scrap of fabric from the ground. Soaked in oil. It smelled like linseed oil. A guild mark on the fabric. Small, almost imperceptible. The letter Z. The Enchanters Guild. Sarah showed it to Daniel. He looked at it. He nodded. Then he stood up and walked into the workshop. Lily came running in 20 minutes later, out of breath. She'd been sleeping at Maggie's tavern. She'd seen the smoke and run all the way across the block. She burst into the workshop and stopped. She looked at the hole in the wall, at the charred beams, at the ashes on the floor. Then she looked at Daniel. He was standing at the workbench, sketching. Lily asked what he was doing. He said he was drawing up a restoration plan. She asked if he was doing it right now. He said right now. Because in a week, customers would come to them looking for potions that no longer existed, and for lamps that he couldn't make in the burned-down workshop. And every day of downtime was a day when the guilds thought they'd won. He wasn't going to give them that day. The restoration took 12 days. Daniel didn't just rebuild the burned-down wall. He rebuilt the workshop. He divided it into zones. The front section, receiving customers and handing out orders. The counter, shelves with finished goods. A spot for Lily and her notebook. The middle section, the forge and assembly area. The bellows. The workbench. Tools. This is where he worked himself. The back section, the alchemical laboratory. A separate room. Stone walls. Stone floor. A ventilation duct made of sheet metal leading to the roof. A separate exit to the backyard. This is where Emma worked. There were doors between the zones. Not wooden ones. They were lined with sheet metal. If one zone caught fire, the others would remain intact. He had learned his lesson. Maggie provided the money for the renovation. From her savings, 5 silver coins. Everything she had set aside. Daniel said he'd pay it back with interest. Maggie said that if he mentioned the word interest one more time, she'd hit him with a frying pan. She said it wasn't a loan. It was an investment. Because his business brings customers to her tavern. And because she believes in him, even though he's a stubborn fool who sleeps only 4 hours a night. Haun helped too. In 3 days, she found a supplier of cheap bricks in the suburbs, and a supplier of sheet metal, and a supplier of herbs to replace the ones that burned, all at below market prices. Daniel asked how she did it. She smiled and said she had a little book. By the end of the 12th day, the workshop was bigger and better than it had been before the fire. 3 separate work areas, an emergency exit, fire-resistant partitions, a water tank on the roof in case of another arson attack, and Daniel set up a night watch. Sarah hired 2 retired guards, former colleagues. They took turns on duty from sunset to sunrise, 1 silver coin a month each. Expensive, but cheaper than losing everything all over again. By the 4th month, Daniel had the assembly line up and running. He never used that word in front of anyone. They wouldn't have understood it here. But the principle was the same as at his factory in Ohio. Division of labor. Each person performs a single step. They do it quickly and precisely. Then they pass it on to the next person. Potions. Before, Emma had brewed every vial from start to finish herself. 1 person, every step, 6 hours per batch of 10 vials. Now Daniel had broken the process down into 6 stages. Washing the herbs, grinding, soaking, the first heating, mixing, the second heating, and bottling. 6 people, 6 steps. Each person does their own. Emma checks the quality at the end. A batch of 10 jars in 2 hours instead of 6. 3 times faster. And most importantly, each of the 6 workers mastered their operation in 2 days. Not 3 years as in the guild. In 2 days. Because he taught a single movement, a single skill, not the entire craft, but 1 step. That was the key. The guilds kept their knowledge secret because the knowledge was holistic. To brew a potion, you had to know everything. All the ingredients, all the proportions, all the temperatures, all the subtleties. 3 years of training. And secrecy made sense because a master could leave and take all that knowledge with him. But at Daniel's, each worker knew only their own stage of the process. The washer knew how to wash. The grinder knew how to grind. No one knew the entire recipe except Emma and Daniel, but together they made potions faster and cheaper than the entire guild. The price dropped even further. The basic healing potion now cost 5 copper coins. 5. While the guild's version cost 6 silver coins. The difference was so staggering that people couldn't believe it. They'd come in and ask what the catch was. Daniel would say there was no catch. He just didn't add 4 extra ingredients and didn't pay the master for a robe. The line outside the shop stretched a whole block. Mi took orders from morning till night. Ha-In hauled herbs from the suburbs in a cart she'd hired for 7 copper coins a day. Lily and her boys darted around the city like quicksilver. Sarah stood by the door and looked out at the world with that gaze that made people lose any desire to cause trouble. Daniel worked. He forged. He gathered. He sketched. He checked. He counted. At night, he shook with exhaustion. His temples throbbed. Blood ran from his nose. He wiped it away and carried on. The guilds had set fire to the workshop, destroying all the potion supplies and a third of the building. Daniel rebuilt the workshop in 12 days, dividing it into 3 fire-resistant sections. He launched assembly line potion production, breaking the process down into 6 steps and lowering the price to 5 mi per vial compared to the guild's 6 silver. In the 5th month, Celestina Davenport arrived. Daniel was working on a new batch of lamps that day, 30 of them, his largest order yet, for the garrison barracks. Caspian Voigt had sent the request. The governor wanted Carter's lamps in every watchtower. Daniel took this as a good sign. The more the lamps were integrated into the city's infrastructure, the harder it would be to shut it down. The door opened, and a woman he wasn't expecting walked in. Tall, light hair styled in an elaborate updo. Her posture was so upright that Daniel instinctively straightened up himself. An expensive dress, delicate fabric, lace on the gloves. She looked as if she'd stumbled into the workshop by accident while searching for the ballroom. She looked around. She looked at the horn, at the workbench cluttered with parts, at Emma stained with chemicals, at Sarah with her prosthetic limb, at Lily on the overturned bucket. Then she looked at Daniel. He was standing by the workbench with a file in his hand and sawdust in his hair. She introduced herself. Celestine Davenport, the youngest daughter of Baron Davenport. 5 years in the Enchanters Guild. Daniel grew wary. The Enchanters Guild. The very same one whose mark was on the fabric used to set his workshop on fire. Celestina noticed his gaze. She said she'd left the guild a week ago, of her own accord. Daniel asked why. She said she was bored. For 5 years, she'd sat in the guild's workshop polishing crystals for lamps. 8 hours a day, polishing crystals. All the same. Same size, same shape, same purpose. 5 years. Because she was a woman and the guild didn't trust women with anything more complicated than polishing. Then, at the market, she overheard an old woman telling her neighbor about a lamp with a replaceable crystal. The old woman said that for the first time in 10 years, she could see her granddaughter's face clearly, because the light was even, warm. It doesn't flicker. Celestina went to look at this lamp. She stood in line for half an hour. She picked up the lamp. She unscrewed the crystal. She screwed it back in. And she realized that this simple mechanism was more interesting than anything she'd done in the 5 years she'd been in the guild. She asked if she could work for Master Carter. Daniel asked what she could do. She said she could polish crystals, and that she could speak 4 languages, and play the lute, and make small talk, and choose wine. Daniel said. Emma chuckled quietly behind his back. Celestina added that she also knew how to take apart mechanisms, any kind, ever since she was a child. Her father had given her an old watch when she was 8, and she'd taken it apart down to the last gear in half a day. Then she put it back together. The watch worked. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he walked over to the workbench. He picked up one of his lamps, a new one, a fully assembled one. He placed it in front of Celestina. He told her she could take it apart and put it back together, and that he'd time her. Celestina took off her gloves. Her fingers were long and slender. Her nails were trimmed short. Not aristocratic nails, a worker's nails. She picked up the lamp. She turned it over in her hands, found the socket, unscrewed the crystal, bent back the case clips, removed the shade, pulled out the inner frame. She laid them out on the table, 8 parts in a row. Then she put them back together, in reverse order, precisely, without a hitch. The lamp lit up. Daniel looked at her. Then he said he needed someone for the watchmaking workshop. He was planning to open it in 6 months, but until then, she'd have to work on the lamp assembly line. Celestina asked how much the pay. Daniel said 2 silver coins a month. She looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled. She said that 2 silver coins was less than what her father paid the stable hand. Then she said she agreed. She took off her lace cuffs and hung them on a nail by the door. And she stayed. The team was assembled. Maggie handled finances and order processing. Emma managed the alchemy workshop. Sarah handled security and logistics. Haun handled procurement and trade. Lily ran intelligence and the courier service. Celestina worked on the assembly line and was preparing for the clock workshop. 6 women surrounding a single engineer. Daniel sometimes caught himself thinking that if any of his colleagues at the factory in Ohio saw this, They'd conclude he'd ended up not in a fantasy world, but in a very strange dream. But he had no time to think about that. In the guild's 6th month, they switched to a new tactic: counterfeits. Lily brought the first piece of news. She had run back from the market, out of breath and flushed. She said that at the Southern Bazaar they were selling potions bearing his mark. But not his. Daniel went to take a look. On the merchant's stall stood vials, with stoppers, with his symbol on the side, a circle with a hammer and a gear. He bought one, opened it, sniffed it. Tinted water. No healing effect whatsoever. 0. He picked up a second one. Same thing. A third one. Slightly better, but only 3% effective. Useless. The vendor didn't know who supplied it to him, or at least said he didn't know. It was just cheap. 3 copper coins per bottle. Cheaper than Daniel's. People bought it. They thought it was his product. They drank it. It didn't help. They got angry. They started saying that Carter's potions had stopped working, that he'd gotten rich and started cutting corners, that it had all been a scam from the very beginning. Daniel knew this scheme. In his world, it was called brand sabotage. Flood the market with a cheap knockoff under someone else's name. The buyer gets disappointed. The original's reputation crumbles. Classic. But he had an answer. He sat down at the table and thought for a full day. Then he developed a triple-check system. First, the notch at the bottom of the bottle. 3 parallel lines, hand-carved with a chisel. It could be faked, but it took time and effort. Second, the color of the wax on the stopper. His potions were sealed with green wax, not just any green, but a specific shade. He added a drop of copper sulfate to the wax, giving it a slightly bluish tint. The counterfeits were sealed with ordinary green wax. The difference was subtle but visible if you knew where to look. Third, a hidden mark inside the stopper. A small letter K carved into the underside of the stopper. It's not visible from the outside. You have to pull out the stopper to see it. He gathered everyone, the employees, the customers, and Lily's boys, and he showed them. 3 signs: the notch, the wax, the letter. If all 3 were present, it was his potion. If even one was missing, it was a fake. Lily and the boys walked all over the lower city in 2 days. They explained it to every regular customer. They showed them. They taught them how to check. At the market, Daniel set up a table. Once a week, on Wednesdays, anyone could come and bring a vial, and he'd check it right there in front of them, for free. Counterfeits began to decline. Merchants were afraid to sell them because buyers were now checking them. The guilds had wasted their money. But Daniel knew this was just one round, not the fight itself. Celestina Davenport, a former master artisan of the Enchanters Guild with a talent for mechanics, joined the team. The guilds began flooding the market with counterfeit potions bearing Carter's mark. Daniel introduced a triple verification system for authenticity and taught the townspeople how to distinguish genuine goods from fakes. In the 8th month, an old man came to Daniel. His name was Harold. He was about 60, maybe older. His skin was as weathered as an old boot. His eyes were weary. He leaned on a cane made from a crooked branch. His left leg ended below the knee. A wooden stump, rough, wrapped in rags. He sat down on a bench by the counter and said he hadn't come for a potion. He'd come because he'd heard about the Guardian, about the 3 brushes, about the snap and the replacement. He asked if Master Carter could do anything for his leg. Daniel asked him to remove the stump. Harold did. The stump was red, chafed, calloused. The skin was cracked in places. 30 years on a wooden prosthesis. 30 years. Daniel crouched down in front of him. He asked for permission to touch it. Harold nodded. Daniel placed his hand on the stump. The information came instantly. The bone had fused long ago and was solid. The muscles were atrophied, but alive. The skin was sensitive. The nerve endings were active. That meant it hurt every day, every step. 30 years of pain. Daniel removed his hand. Then he took out a piece of paper and a pencil. He asked Harold where it hurt the most. Harold pointed to the inner side, where the bone was closest to the skin. Daniel made a note of it. He asked if he liked walking upstairs. Harold looked at him strangely. Then he said he lived on the second floor. 12 steps. Every climb is a trial. But he's used to it. Daniel wrote it down. He asked how much he weighed. Harold didn't know. Daniel guessed by eye. About 80 kilograms. He wrote it down. He asked if he walked on uneven ground, through mud or over rocks. Harold said he was a former farmer. Fields and roads were his life. Daniel wrote it down. Then he said he'd come back in 4 days. For 4 days, he worked exclusively on the prosthesis. The lamps and knives were put away. Emma ran the workshop on her own. Sarah was clearing out the backlog. Ha-Un brought in a shipment of herbs and unloaded it with Lily's boys. The workshop carried on without him. He shut himself in the smithy and worked. A prosthetic leg was more complicated than a prosthetic arm. An arm performs precise movements. A leg bears weight, 80 kilograms with every step. The main problem is the foot. A wooden stump is rigid. When it touches the ground, the impact travels upward along the bone. After 30 years, the bone aches from every such impact. Shock absorption is needed. A spring. He carved the foot out of ash wood, hard wood, but the shape isn't flat. It's curved, like a leaf. The front part curves slightly upward. The back part does too. With each step, the foot springs slightly. Not much, but enough to soften the impact. Between the foot and the sleeve, he installed a steel hinge, an ankle joint. Simple. Single axis. Forward and backward. That's enough for walking up and down stairs. Without the hinge, every step on a stair is torture. With the hinge, the foot adjusts to the angle. He made the sleeve out of tanned leather. Thick. Soft. He took the mold from Harold's stump, a clay cast, and then shaped the leather to fit the cast. Inside the sleeve is a soft wool pad. Between the pad and the leather is a thin layer of felt. 3 layers between the bone and the outside world. It's secured with 2 straps, below the knee and above. Straps with buckles that can be tightened with one hand. Harold lives alone. He has to put on the prosthesis by himself, without anyone's help. That was a mandatory condition. Daniel didn't say it out loud, but every element was designed so that a 60-year-old man with 1 leg and 2 arms could manage on his own. On the 4th day, he called for Harold. The old man came in. He sat down on the bench. Daniel fitted him with the socket. He tightened the straps. He asked him to stand up. Harold stood up. He swayed a little. Daniel supported him by the elbow. Then he let go. Harold was standing, on 2 legs. His left leg was slightly shorter, but Daniel had placed a thin cork plate under his foot. Now it was even. Daniel said he needed to walk a bit. Harold took a step. His foot touched the floor. The spring activated. Softly, quietly. There was no impact. A second step. A third. Harold walked across the workshop, past the workbench, past the kiln, past the shelf with the lamps. He reached the wall, turned around, walked back. 3 steps, 4, 5. He stopped in the middle of the room. Everyone was watching him. Emma was by the shelf. Sarah was by the door. Lily was on the bucket. Ha-Un was at the table with the papers. Celestina was by the window. Maggie was in the doorway with the children behind her. Harold stood in the middle of the workshop. He didn't move. His face was expressionless. Then a tear ran down his cheek. One, then another. He was crying silently, without wiping his face. 30 years working with wood. 30 years of pain with every step. And now here he was, standing. And it didn't hurt. No one said a word. Celestina stood by the window and whispered, "Master, what do you do to people?" Daniel stood next to Harold, not knowing what to do with his hands. Then he said that the mount needed to be adjusted some more, and that the cushion would need to be replaced every 3 months, and that the hinge needed to be lubricated. Harold was silent. Then he said he wanted to climb the stairs. Daniel said it was too soon for stairs. He needed to walk on level ground for a week, to get used to it. Then the stairs. Harold looked at him. Then he said thank you. Just one word. Quietly. And that word was worth more than all 300 gold pieces that Feder had offered. Daniel asked how much he could pay. Harold said he had 20 copper coins. Daniel said that was enough. Harold left. Slowly, carefully, but on his own 2 feet. Emma walked over to Daniel and whispered that 20 copper coins wouldn't even cover the cost of the leather. Daniel said he knew. Then he went back to his workbench and started working on the next order. A week later, a rumor spread through town. Not about potions, not about lamps. About a leg. Old Harold is walking. He hadn't walked properly for 30 years, and now he's walking. Without a cane. Up the stairs. 3 more people came to see Daniel. A woman missing 3 fingers on one hand. A boy with a foot that had been deformed since birth. A former soldier with a stiff knee. Daniel saw them all. He took down their details. He measured them. He began sketching. He knew that prosthetics wouldn't become the foundation of his business. It would take too long. It was too individualized. Too costly in terms of time and materials. But he knew something else. Every prosthetic is a story. And stories are what people pass on to one another. And each such story makes him a little more invulnerable to the guilds. Because it's hard to convince townspeople that a man is a warlock if that man put their grandfather back on his feet yesterday. Daniel made a prosthetic leg for Harold, an elderly veteran, with a spring-loaded foot and a soft sleeve. For the first time in 30 years, Harold was able to walk without pain. Word of the prosthetic spread throughout the city, and 3 more disabled people came to Daniel with orders. In the 10th month, the guild struck a blow against their supply chain. Ha-In was the first to notice. She came into the workshop that morning, pale and angry. She said that the herb supplier from the southern province had cut her off, without explanation. He simply said he could no longer sell to her. Daniel asked if she could find another one. She said she had. The second one turned her down too. And the third. And the fourth. All suppliers within a 3-day journey of Kronheim had simultaneously stopped selling her anything. Herbs, crystals, metal, oil, wax, everything. Daniel sat at the table and listened. Emma was counting the supplies. Enough herbs for 2 weeks. Crystals for 10 days. Steel for a week. After that, the workshop would grind to a halt. Not because there were no customers, there were enough customers to last for months, but because there was nothing to work with. The guilds didn't attack him directly. They struck at his supply lines. They bought up the contracts of all the major suppliers in the region. They paid a year's worth in advance, on the condition that not a single gram of goods would go to Master Carter. Not under his name, not under someone else's, not through middlemen. If a supplier violated this condition, they would lose their guild contract forever. And a guild contract meant guaranteed sales for years to come. No one would take that risk for the sake of a single master from the lower city. Daniel gathered everyone that evening. The workshop was cramped. Maggie sat on a bench with the children. Emma stood by the shelf. Sarah was by the door. Ha-In sat at the table with a notebook. Lily sat on a bucket. Celestina stood by the window. 6 assembly line workers lined the wall. 2 guards stood at the doors. The boy courier sat on the floor. 22 people. Everyone was looking at Daniel. He told the truth. Supplies would last 2 weeks. If he didn't find new suppliers, the workshop would close. Not forever, but for a long time. And during that time, the guilds would have time to convince the city that he was a fraud. Maggie asked what to do. Daniel said they needed to go where the guilds couldn't reach. To the mountains, to the villages, straight to the herbalists and miners, bypassing the middlemen and brokers, signing contracts in person. Ha-In opened her notebook. She said she had 3 names. 3 people in mountain villages 2 days' journey to the north. Her father's contacts. Old ones, but still active. An herbalist in the village of Holmwood. A miner in the settlement of Greystone. And a farmer who grows medicinal herbs in the valley beyond the pass. None of them are connected to the guilds. Too far away. too small time. The guilds hadn't cared about them. Until now. Daniel said he'd go himself. Sarah said he wouldn't go alone. Daniel said the workshop couldn't be left unguarded. Sarah said the guards would manage. But he won't make it to the mountains without her because his only weapon is a file. Ha-In said she'd go too, because she has the contacts, and because she knows Eastern business etiquette, which will come in handy with her father's people. Daniel looked at Emma. Emma nodded. She'll manage. The workshop will run on its stockpiles while they last. Maggie will handle the reception. Lily will keep an eye on the town. Celestina will help Emma with the lamps. They set out at dawn. A wagon, one horse. Sarah was driving. Ha-In sat beside him with a book on her lap. Daniel sat in the back and watched as Kronheim faded beyond the horizon. For the first time in 10 months, he was leaving the city. The road was rough. Ruts, mud, rocks. The wagon jolted. Sarah cursed under her breath every time a wheel sank into a pothole. Ha-In was silent, counting something in her head. Daniel looked around. Trees, fields, streams, and tracks everywhere. Shattered lanterns on the roadside. Rusty. Guild-made. Thrown away because the crystal had burned out. A wooden harrow in the field, broken, its tines sticking out like rotten teeth. It had been there so long that weeds had grown right through it. The farmer can't fix it because the guild won't repair it, and he can't buy a new one because it's too expensive. He lay on the hay in the wagon and saw a world suffocating from greed. Not from poverty, from greed. There were resources. There was ore. Grasses grew, trees stood. People had hands. But between their hands and the materials stood 7 guilds saying it couldn't be done. The first village, Homewood. 20 houses, stone walls, thatched roofs. Cows roam the streets. On the edge of the village, a field strewn with stones. Beyond the field, a forest. A scent in the forest. Spicy. Bitter. Herbs. The herbalist lived off the beaten path. An old man, gray-haired. His hands were large and dark from the earth. His name was Morgan. He looked at Ha-In, then at Daniel, then at Sarah with her prosthetic leg. Ha-In spoke up. She mentioned her father's name. Morgan was silent for a long time. Then he said he remembered him. He was a good man. It's a shame he died. They sat at the table in his house, a wooden table scraped white. Clay mugs. Herbal tea. Daniel drank, and his ability kicked in automatically. Wild St. John's wort, mountain mint, field chamomile, honey. Everything was pure. Everything was potent. The concentration of active compounds was 3 times higher than in city herbs, because the mountain soil was closer to the etheric veins. The herbs here were naturally imbued with energy. No crystals, no magic. Just from the earth. Daniel asked Morgan how much he harvested per season. Morgan said a lot. More than he could sell. The city was far away. Buyers came once a year and paid peanuts. Daniel offered a contract. Regular purchases. Once every 2 weeks. A wagon would arrive, pick up the goods, pay on the spot. At prices twice as high as the middlemen's. Morgan looked at him. Then he asked why he needed so many herbs. Daniel said he used them to make medicine. Cheap medicine. For ordinary people. Morgan was silent. Then he said, "It's a deal." The second contract was in Greystone, a mining town. 20 mines. Small ones, 1 or 2 veins each. The arcane crystals were tiny, just shards. The guilds wouldn't take them. Too small by their standards. The miners sold them for next to nothing to random traders or just threw them away. Daniel arrived in the settlement and asked to see the spoil heap, a mountain of waste rock where everything unwanted was dumped. He walked through the dump for 2 hours. He touched the stones. Each stone told him its own story. Here and there, crystal shards were embedded in the rock, tiny ones, the size of a fingernail. The guilds considered them trash. Daniel knew they were perfect for his lamps. A small crystal in a small socket with 4 prongs. It lasts 6 weeks. It costs a copper coin, a penny. He'd struck a deal with the miner's foreman. Anything small and useless, anything they usually throw away, he buys it. 2 pennies a sack. The foreman looked at him like he was crazy, then he shook his hand. The third contract. A farmer in the valley beyond the pass, a young man, 30 years old, a wife, 3 children, 10 acres of land on which he grew lavender, sage, thyme, and mint. He sold small quantities at the local market. The Herbalists Guild ignored him because his volumes were too small. Daniel suggested he expand his crops. He gave him an advance of 2 silver coins, a 1-year contract, fixed prices, a guaranteed buyout of the harvest. The farmer agreed without a second thought. An advance of 2 silver coins was more than half a year's income for him. They were driving back to Kronheim. 3 contracts, 3 suppliers, herbs from the mountains, crystals from the mining dump, medicinal plants from the farmer. None of them were affiliated with the guilds. None of them were subject to their blockade. Sarah drove the cart and remained silent. Then she said he'd found a loophole. Daniel said that every blockade has loopholes. You just have to look where the enemy thinks it's not worth paying attention to. Ha-In sat next to her and wrote in a notebook. New names, new routes, new numbers. She looked up and said that if he gave her another month, she'd find 10 such suppliers. Not 3, 10. Daniel said he'd give her 2. She smiled. Kronheim appeared on the horizon at sunset on the 3rd day. Stone walls, towers, smoke rising above the rooftops. Daniel looked at the city and thought. 10 months ago, he had been lying face down in sawdust on the floor of an abandoned workshop. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who he was now. He didn't know why. Now he had a workshop, a team, clients, suppliers, and an enemy who had finally begun to fear him. That was a good sign. The guilds had organized a blockade by buying up the contracts of all the suppliers in the region. Daniel, along with Sarah and Ha-Un, took a 3-day trip to the mountain villages and signed direct contracts with Morgan the herbalist, as well as with miners and a farmer who were too small-scale and too far away for the guilds to control them. In the 11th month, Daniel opened a watchmaking workshop. Celestina had been waiting for this for half a. She worked on assembling lamps and never once complained. But Daniel saw how she looked at the gears, how she picked up tiny parts and twirled them between her fingers, how she sketched mechanisms on scraps of paper that didn't yet exist. He gave her the back room on the 2nd floor, a small one, with a window facing east, morning light, best for delicate work. He set up a table and a set of tools there, fine-tipped pliers, a magnifying glass, tweezers, file blades, a small anvil the size of a fist. He did it all himself. He called for Celestina. She climbed the stairs. She paused in the doorway. She looked around the room. At the table. At the tools. At the light streaming in from the window. Daniel said this was her workshop. She would make watches, and locks, and any small mechanism she could come up with. He said he didn't know anything about watches, and that she would decide for herself. Celestina stood in the doorway and said nothing. Then she walked over to the table. She ran her fingers over the tools. She picked up a pair of tweezers. She turned them over in her hands. She put them back. Then she turned to face him. Her eyes were strange, shiny. She said that in her 27 years of life, not a single person had ever expected her to work. They expected smiles and poses and a dowry. But he expected work. Then she said thank you, and closed the door. 3 days later, a steady ticking sound came from the room upstairs. Celestina had assembled her first clock. From scraps, from trash, from parts she'd filed down with a needle file over 2 days with almost no sleep. The clock was crude. The case was made of tin. The dial was made from a scrap of bone. The hands were made of wire. But it kept time, and it kept time accurately. Daniel checked it against the sundial in the square. It ran slow by 2 minutes a day. The Watchmakers Guild sold theirs for 15 gold pieces, and theirs ran slow by 5 minutes. Celestina had made a better one. made from scrap. Alongside the clock workshop, Daniel was working on another project, the one that would change everything. A manufactory. Not a workshop for 20 people, but a real manufacturing facility, with production halls, with a training room, with a warehouse, with a quality control system. He drew up the plans every evening. The building. 2 stories. First floor, alchemy workshop, blacksmith's workshop, lamp assembly workshop, watchmaking workshop, raw materials warehouse, finished goods warehouse. Second floor, training room, office, rooms for workers who live far away, dining hall. He needed money for construction, a lot of money. 20 gold pieces for materials, 10 for workers, 5 for furniture and tools. A total of 35 gold pieces. Daniel had saved up 7. Over 10 months of continuous work. 7 gold pieces. He needed another 28. He went to see Caspian Voigt. The deputy governor's assistant received him in the city council office, a small room with a single window. On the wall hung a map of Kronheim. Papers lay on the table. Caspian listened. Daniel spoke. He explained what the factory would bring to the city. Jobs, 40 people, inexpensive goods, taxes for the treasury, competition for the guilds. That's what the governor wants, leverage. But that leverage needs to be built. Caspian asked how much. Daniel said 28 gold pieces as a loan, secured by a commitment to supply the city. Caspian thought it over. Then he said he would pass the request on to the governor. The reply came 3 days later. The governor approved the loan, 28 gold pieces, secured by a commitment to supply potions and lamps to the city garrison and the night watch for 2 years. The terms were strict. The volumes were large. The deadlines were tight. If Daniel failed to fulfill his obligations, the loan would become a debt, and his property would pass to the crown. Daniel signed the agreement. Construction began on the first day of the 12th month. He found a building, a former warehouse on the riverbank. Stone walls, high ceilings, wide gates, neglected but sturdy. The landlord asked for 3 silver coins a month. Daniel paid 6 months' rent in advance. 20 men worked on the renovation for 2 weeks, masons, carpenters, and roofers. Daniel supervised the work personally. He checked every brick, every beam, and every plank with his own hands. He weeded out the defective ones. At first, the builders were annoyed. Then they got used to it. Then they began to respect him, because no foreman in their lives had ever known the materials better than they did. By the end of the 2nd week, the workshop was up and running. Not perfect, but functional. 4 workrooms on the 1st floor, a training room on the 2nd, storage rooms on either side, a dining hall in the annex. Daniel moved everything from the old workshop in 2 days: the workbench, the forge, the tools, and the supplies. Emma moved the lab. Sarah organized security at the new location. Haun moved in with her papers and notebook. Lily ran through the new building 3 times and said there were 12 places to hide. Celestina moved the watchmaking workshop upstairs to a room with 2 windows. More light, more space. She was happy. Maggie stayed at the tavern. But now the tavern was more than just a reception area. Daniel had registered it as the official sales office for Carter's Manufactory, with a sign, with a price list on the wall, with Maggie at the helm. She was the first sales outlet. A second one would open in a month, in another neighborhood, then a third. He was always thinking ahead, always looking ahead. By the 12th month, the factory was operating at full capacity. 40 people, 6 operations in the alchemy workshop, 4 in the forge, 3 in the assembly shop. The watchmaking workshop was still run by just one person, Celestina, but her first apprentice had joined her. A 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a watchmaker who had died 2 years earlier. Slender fingers, sharp eyes. Celestina taught her with a patience Daniel hadn't expected from an aristocrat. Every worker in the factory had a name in the register, a salary, a schedule, days off. Daniel insisted on days off, 1 day a week. No one in Kronheim gave workers days off. It was considered a luxury. Daniel said that a tired worker makes mistakes, and mistakes cost more than a single day off. People whispered. Then they got used to it. Then they started working better. Because for the first time in their lives, someone had told them they had the right to rest. In the 13th month, Daniel found Albrecht Ven's notebook. It happened by chance. Lily brought back a rumor from the market. The boys said that in the basement of the old guild archive, which had partially burned down 50 years ago, there were still books and papers lying around. The entrance was blocked, but you could crawl through a sewer drain. The boys would sneak in there for scraps of copper to sell to a junk dealer. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he asked Lily exactly where this basement was. She drew a map on a scrap of paper. The basement was beneath the former residence of the Artifactors Guild, the very same guild founded by Albrecht Venn 300 years ago. Daniel went there at night, alone. Sarah was against it. Daniel said he would crawl through the sewer drain, and Sarah, with her prosthetic leg, wouldn't be able to fit. Sarah said she could crawl anywhere. Daniel said he needed someone to stand outside and keep watch. Sarah agreed, reluctantly. The drain was narrow. The stone walls were damp with moisture. It smelled of mold and rot. Daniel crawled on his elbows. A lantern was tied to his belt, a small one, with its crystal. After 20 meters, the passage led to a basement. The ceiling was low. The beams were charred. The floor was covered with ash and debris. And books. Dozens of books. Most of them burned, blackened, crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. Daniel moved slowly through the basement. He touched every book. His ability worked here, too. Paper, ink, age, condition. Most were unreadable. The fire had devoured the text. But in a corner, beneath the rubble of a stone shelf, lay a stack of 3 notebooks. The shelf had shielded them from the heat. Daniel picked up the top one, a leather cover, worn, old, 300 years old. He opened it and froze. The handwriting, fine, neat, letters he had never seen in this world, but which he recognized instantly. Latin script. Not just Latin script. Old English. The text was written in the language of his world. His hands trembled. He flipped through the pages. Notes, formulas, drawings, alloy charts, recipes, and interspersed among the technical notes were paragraphs of text, thoughts, reflections, fears. The author wrote about how he came to this world, about how he discovered he could see materials, about how he tried to change the way crafts were practiced, about how he founded a guild, not to monopolize knowledge, but to spread it, to teach people how to make things correctly, cheaply, for everyone. His name was Albrecht Venn, and he was a time traveler, like Daniel, 300 years ago, from a world resembling the early Renaissance. He too could see right through materials. He too tried to build a manufactory. He too ran into those who wanted to keep knowledge a secret. Only in his case, it wasn't rival guilds. It was his own students, the ones he had taught. They realized that secret knowledge is power, and that sharing power isn't profitable. They killed their teacher. They burned his notes, and they turned his guild into what it became, a monopoly. On the last page of the notebook, Daniel found an entry. The handwriting was different, hasty. The letters were jumbled. The person had written in a hurry, or in fear. If you're reading this, don't repeat my mistake. Don't try to convince the masters. Teach the apprentices. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat in the darkness of the basement and breathed. 300 years ago, another man from another world walked the same path, and he failed, because he trusted those who already held power, instead of passing on knowledge to those who had no power. Daniel thought of Emma, who had been expelled for asking a question, Lily, who lived on the streets, the assembly line workers, who came to him because they had nowhere else to go. Apprentices, not masters. Journeymen. Venn was right. Daniel crawled out of the drain, dirty and wet. Sarah was waiting. She looked at the notebook in his hands. She asked what it was. Daniel said it was a message from a man who had tried to do the same thing 300 years ago and failed. Sarah asked why he had failed. Daniel said it was because he'd taught the wrong people. For the next 2 weeks, he read the notebooks, all 3 of them. Then had left behind more than just philosophy. He left behind knowledge. Formulas for alloys that were better than anything the guilds were using now. Potion recipes an order of magnitude more effective than the guild's own. Blueprints for mechanisms that Daniel could adapt for his own production. 300 years ago, this man knew more than all 7 guilds combined, and his knowledge lay in the basement under a layer of ash and oblivion. Daniel transcribed everything. He translated it into the local language. He organized it systematically. He broke it down into modules. And he began teaching. Not in secret, not just for the select few. Openly, in the manufactory's training hall. 2 hours every evening. Any worker could come. Any apprentice off the street could come. For free. He taught the basics, how steel is made, why one herb heals and another doesn't, how a crystal works, what melting point is, what proportion is, what quality control is. Simple things, the foundation. 8 people came to the first class, 12 to the second, 20 to the third. A month later, 40 people were crammed into the training hall every evening. They sat on the floor, on the windowsills, they stood in the doorways. Apprentices from the guilds came secretly, after work, wearing hoods, afraid of being recognized, but they came. Because for the first time in their lives, someone was explaining to them not what to do, but why. It was a weapon, the most powerful of all. Not potions, not lamps, not prosthetics. Knowledge. A year. Exactly 1 year since the day Daniel Carter woke up face down in sawdust. And on that day, the guilds came for him. For real. It all began with 3 things happening at once. First, the guilds bought up every available raw material within a 100-mile radius. Not just from their regular suppliers, from everyone. Herbs, crystals, metal, wood, leather, oil. They paid double the market price. Up front. For half a year. Even the mountain villages. Even Morgan. Even the miners in Greystone. A man in a blue cloak visited each of them and offered a sum they couldn't refuse. Morgan refused. They burned down his drying shed. After that, he didn't refuse. Ha-Yin at the factory, pale as chalk. She said that all supply lines had been cut off. All of them. They had 10 days' worth of supplies left. After that, the factory would shut down. Second, a rumor began to spread through the taverns and markets. Quiet. Venomous. Red rot had been found in Carter's potions, a disease that kills children. No one knew exactly who had found it, but everyone was talking. By evening on the first day, 3 regular customers came in and demanded their money back. By morning on the second day, the line outside the workshop had disappeared. For the first time in 6 months, instead of customers, people came with questions. Angry, frightened. A mother holding a child, screaming that she'd given her child the potion and was now afraid. Daniel went out to her. He asked to see the vial. He checked it. It was his potion. Genuine, pure. No red rot. He explained. The woman wouldn't listen. She kept screaming. The third one. Master Cornelius Gray filed a formal charge of heresy against the craft with the city court. Official. Sealed with the seals of all 7 guilds. The charge stated that Master Carter was using forbidden methods to manipulate the ether veins, that his products were poisoned, that he posed a threat to the health and lives of the townspeople, and that his factory must be shut down and his property confiscated in favor of the guilds. The trial was set for 3 days later. 3 blows at once. No raw materials, no reputation, no law. Daniel sat in his office on the 2nd floor of the factory, staring at the wall. Everyone was there. Maggie, Emma, Sarah, Ha-Un, Lily, Celestina. They were silent, waiting for him to speak. He was thinking. The engineer in him was breaking down the problem. 3 problems, 3 solutions. He had to find them in 3 days. Raw materials. He couldn't win back his suppliers in 3 days, but he didn't need suppliers for 3 days. He needed to hold out until the trial. 10 days' worth of supplies. That would be enough. Reputation. He had to disprove the rumor about the red rot, not with words, with action, publicly, so that every citizen could see it with their own eyes. The trial. That was the most important thing. If he won the trial, the guild would lose its legal leverage. If he lost, he would lose everything. He started with his reputation. The next morning, he went out to the market square with a small table. On the table were 2 vials, his potion and the guild's. He'd bought the guild's for 6 silver coins, the last 6 silver coins from his personal funds. Next to the vials stood 2 small glass bowls and a small vial of silver solution. He'd made it the night before. Silver dissolved in acid, a simple reagent. Silver darkens when it comes into contact with lead. A pure solution remains clear. He stood in the square and waited. People approached. They looked. They whispered. They didn't come too close. He poured the guild potion into the first bowl, his own into the second. He added a drop of the silver solution to each. The guild potion clouded over. It turned gray. Lead. In the medicinal potion. In a potion drunk by children, the elderly, and the sick. Lead. His potion remained clear, transparent. He said this aloud. Silver darkens when mixed with lead. There should be no lead in a medicinal potion. That's not his rule. It's written in the Alchemists Guild Charter, page 47. Anyone who's interested can read it aloud. Silence. People stood and looked at the 2 bowls, the gray one and the clear one. Then it began. An old woman named Ingrid stepped out of the crowd. The very same one. With failing eyesight. With a Carter lamp on the table that gave her light. She stood next to him, silently. Then Harold, the veteran, on his own 2 feet, without a cane. He stood on the other side. Then Olaf the butcher. Then Anna the laundress. Then Griff the shoemaker. Then 10 people. 20. 50. 100. 200. People stepped out of the crowd and stood next to the small table on which the 2 bowls stood. Each of them had once held his potion, or his knife, or his lamp in their hands. Each knew that it worked. Magister Graves stepped out onto the square, in a flawless robe, with long, slender fingers. He stood on the steps of City Hall and looked out at the crowd, at the 200 people gathered around the table, at the gray bowl containing his own potion. He said nothing. Then he turned and walked back into City Hall. Daniel stood in the square, watching him go. Maggie stood nearby, with the children. Emma, Sarah, Haun, Lily, Celestina, and 200 people who had come because they believed not in him, but in what he was doing. The guild struck a 3-pronged blow simultaneously. They bought up all the raw materials within a 100-mile radius. They spread a rumor about poisonous red rot in Carter's potions, and they filed a lawsuit accusing him of heresy against the craft. Daniel stepped out onto the square and publicly proved that the guild's potion contained lead. 200 townspeople stood beside him, and Magister Grave walked away in silence. The trial took place 2 days after the gathering in the square. The great hall of City Hall. Stone walls, tall windows. The spectator benches were filled to capacity. People stood in the aisles. They stood by the doors. They stood on the street. The governor's guards stood around the perimeter, a full contingent, in armor. The governor sat on a dais in a chair bearing the crown's coat of arms. Young, about 35 years old. Dark hair, piercing eyes. Next to him was Caspian Voigt. On the defendant's bench sat Magister Cornelius Grave, in an immaculate robe. Calm. Next to him were representatives of all 7 guilds. 7 men in a row. 7 robes. 7 seals. 300 years of power behind them. Daniel sat in the defendant's chair, in a work shirt, with oil stains on his sleeve. No one beside him. He had refused a defense attorney, said he'd represent himself. Master Grave stood up. He spoke for 20 minutes. His voice was steady. Not a single unnecessary word. He spoke of traditions, of the guild's 300-year history, of how a craft is not just a job, it is a responsibility. That knowledge in unskilled hands is more dangerous than a weapon. That a cheap potion brewed without guild supervision is a risk to life. that no one knows exactly what Master Carter puts in his vials, that the guilds exist to protect people from charlatans. He spoke eloquently, convincingly, with dignity. Daniel listened. Then he stood up. He took a bag out of his bag. He placed it on the table in front of the deputy. He untied it. He laid out 30 vials on the table, 15 of his own, 15 from the guild, each one labeled number, date, place of purchase. He said he had analyzed every vial, both the guild's and his own, and that he was ready to show the results right there. The deputy nodded. Daniel picked up the first guild vial. He opened it. He said it contained 7 ingredients. 4 of them have no medicinal function. They're added for volume, color, and scent. The effective concentration of the active ingredient is 15%. He picked up his own. 3 ingredients, all active. The effective concentration is 65%. I picked up the next pair. A guild-approved painkiller. It contains 4% lead powder. Lead dulls the nerves. It creates the illusion of pain relief, but it poisons the body. With regular use, it destroys the kidneys and liver. Page 47 of the Alchemists Guild Charter explicitly prohibits the use of lead in medicinal compounds. He placed a copy of the page on the table, one he'd copied by hand at the city library, word for word. Master Graves sat motionless, his face stony. Daniel continued. 15 pairs. He analyzed each one, by composition, by effectiveness, by cost. The guild potion cost 6 silver coins, the cost of the ingredients, including the extra 4 copper coins, a markup of 180 times. His potion cost 5 copper coins. The cost of ingredients was 2 copper coins, a markup of 2.5 times. The room was silent. Daniel finished with the potions. Then he took 2 knives out of his bag, the guild's and his own. He placed them on the table. He said that the guild's knife would become dull after 10 strikes on oak. His would after 100. He suggested they test it, right then and there, in front of everyone. The deputy looked at the guard by the door. The guard brought an oak block. Daniel took the guild knife. He struck the block. He counted aloud. On the 12th strike, the blade faltered. He showed it to the hall. Then he took his own knife. He struck the block. 20 strikes. 30, 50, 70, 100. He showed the blade. Not a single jam. The hall buzzed. Master Grave raised his hand. The hall fell silent. He stood up. He walked over to the table. He looked at the vials, at the knives, at the papers. Then he looked at Daniel. He said he did not dispute the quality of Master Carter's products, but that quality was not the only criterion. He said that the guild is not just about production, it's about control, order, a system. If anyone could make potions, knives, and lamps without supervision, who would be responsible for the consequences? If an apprentice learned the trade in 2 days instead of 3 years and poisoned someone, who would be held accountable? Master Carter would be held accountable. Personally. For every vial, for every KN, for every lamp. Is he ready for that? Daniel said yes. He said that every vial in his workshop is inspected. Every knife is tested. Every lamp is left burning for 24 hours before it's sold. Every item has a registration number, the master's name, the date of manufacture. If something goes wrong, he'll know exactly what, when, and who made it. He said that's called quality control, and that the guilds don't control quality, they control the price. Master Grave looked at him for a long time. Then he spoke quietly. He said that Daniel had proven to be stronger than he'd thought, but that he didn't understand what he'd set in motion. The governor stood up. The hall fell silent. The governor said that the charge of heresy against the craft was dropped, that Carter's workshop had the right to trade, that the guilds were required to submit the results of their product inspections for lead content within 30 days, and that he would personally send a request to the capital for a royal patent to be granted to Master Carter. The hall erupted. People were shouting. They were banging on the benches. Guards tried to restore order. Master Graves stood up and walked out through a side door. Silence. Not a word. 7 guild representatives sat on the bench, staring straight ahead. 300 years. 300 years of monopoly, and one engineer with a measuring spoon. The patent arrived 2 weeks later. A courier on a lathered horse, a scroll bearing the royal seal. Heavy, thick parchment, dark blue ink. The letters were large and solemn. Daniel Carter, Master Craftsman. Privilege protected by the crown. This meant that no guild could shut down his factory without a direct order from the king. No tax collector could come demanding the patent. No official could seize his goods. He stood in his office, holding the scroll in his hands. He reread his name, written in a stranger's handwriting on a stranger's parchment, in a stranger's world. But it was his name. Carter, an engineer from Ohio, a master craftsman in Valarum. A year ago, that name meant nothing here. Now everyone in the lower city knew him, and many in the upper city as well. He went down the stairs and stepped out onto the factory porch. It was a quiet morning. The sun had just risen. The street was empty. Smoke rose from chimneys above the rooftops. A dog barked somewhere. A cart creaked around the corner. An ordinary morning, a working morning. Daniel sat down on a step. He placed the scroll on his lap and just sat there, thinking of nothing, for the first time in a year of non-stop motion, a year in which every day began with a problem and ended with a drawing, a year in which he never once stopped, never once allowed himself to sit around doing nothing, because if he stopped, the thoughts would come flooding back. Thoughts of home, of his past life, of who he used to be, of the kettle he hadn't turned off, which had probably long since cooled or melted, or someone had turned it off, or maybe no one had turned it off because there was no one to do it. He lived alone, an apartment in Dayton, 2 rooms, a cat named Wrench, who was probably already with his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, because Mrs. Chen always said she'd take the cat if anything happened to Daniel. He hoped she had taken him. He hoped Wrench was doing well. That's it. Enough. He shook his head. That was then. Now there's a step. A scroll. Morning. And the factory behind him, where in an hour 40 people will wake up and start working. Lily found him 10 minutes later. She stepped out the door barefoot. Her hair was sticking out in all directions. Her eyes were sleepy. But she was holding a mug of tea. Hot, with mint and honey. She set the mug down next to him on the step. She said he hadn't eaten again. Daniel took the mug. He drank and thought that the mint was most likely from Morgan in Homewood. Mountain mint. It smells 3 times stronger than the lowland kind, and the honey is from a farmer in the valley. Dark, thick, with a hint of lavender because the apiary is next to a lavender field. And the mug was made by Peter the Potter, whose kiln Daniel had repaired a month ago. There was a crack in the vault. 20 minutes of work. Peter brought 6 mugs as a thank you. Every object in his hands had a story. Each one connected people. The mug connected the mountain herbalist and the valley beekeeper and the city potter and the little girl who remembers which of them hadn't eaten. That was the meaning, not in the scroll, not in the patent, in a mug of tea brought at dawn. An hour later, the others arrived. Maggie was the first, always the first. She walked from the tavern across half the city every morning, in any weather. She carried a basket of bread and a pot of porridge for the factory workers. 40 people needed fed. Maggie fed them. She saw the scroll on Daniel's lap. She set down the basket. She picked up the scroll. She read it slowly, moving her lips. Then she looked at Daniel. Then she hugged him so tight his ribs cracked. The pot of porridge nearly fell. Lily caught it. Maggie said he was a stubborn fool and that she'd known it from day one. When he sat in her tavern, hungry and penniless, asking for a bowl of soup on credit. She knew something would come of it, because normal people have fear or greed or boredom in their eyes, but he had curiosity. And irritation, like a craftsman who sees a crooked nail and can't walk past it. Emma came in second, at a brisk pace. Her hair was tied back haphazardly. There were chemical stains on her apron. She had already been in the workshop. She'd been checking the night's batch of potions. She took the scroll in both hands, read it twice, slowly. Then she took off her glasses and wiped them for a minute, even though they were clean. Then she put them back on. She looked at Daniel. She said that the effectiveness of the new batch of enhanced potion was 75% of the guild standard. It had gone up from 65. She had changed the ratio of thyme to St. John's wort and added a drop of willow bark extract. And if Daniel approved, she wanted to start working on a fourth type of potion, a fever reducer, for children. Because winter was coming soon, and children get sick, and their mothers come asking for help, but she doesn't have a recipe. Daniel said he approved. Emma nodded. She put her glasses in her pocket, took them out, put them back on. She went into the workshop. Sarah read it silently. She nodded. That was the highest praise from Sarah Finch, a woman who didn't waste words on things that could be expressed with a nod. She stood at the factory gate in the morning light, her left hand in a steel prosthesis, her right hand on the hilt of her sword, her back straight, a sentinel's gaze. In a year, she had never once thanked Daniel for the prosthesis. She didn't say things like that. But every morning she stood at his gate, every evening she patrolled the perimeter, and every night one of her guards was on duty on the roof. That was her way of saying thank you. Ha-Un read the letter and took out a notebook. She jotted down the patent number, the date of issuance, the name of the governor who signed the request, the name of the chancellor who approved it. She was already thinking about how to use this in negotiations with suppliers. A royal patent meant that the contract with Carter was no longer at risk. Suppliers used to fear the guilds. Now Carter had the crown behind him. That meant they could increase volumes, expand the network, lower prices. She smiled, subtly, professionally. She said she needed a second cart. Daniel said he'd arrange it. Celestina came down the stairs. She read the scroll. She smiled. She said that now she needed to make a clock worthy of a royal master, and that she had an idea, a striking clock. A small hammer strikes a miniature bell every hour. No clockmaker in Kronheim has ever made one like that. She would make it. Then she turned and went upstairs. A minute later, the sound of a file came from upstairs. Steady, rhythmic. The sound of a person who had found their calling. Lily sat on the step next to Daniel, swinging her legs. She hadn't read the scroll. She couldn't read, but Daniel had already thought of that. In the manufactory's training hall, they now taught more than just a craft in the evenings. They also taught reading and counting, and Lily attended every class. 3 months ago, she didn't know the alphabet. Now she read signs and price tags and names in the registry, slowly, syllable by syllable. But she was reading. In 6 months, she would read the scroll on her own. Daniel was certain of it. The day went on as usual. The manufactory was in full swing. The alchemy workshop hummed with activity. 6 people working on 6 different operations: washing, grinding, soaking, initial heating, mixing, and bottling. Emma walked among them, checking each stage, the clang of hammers from the forge. 2 blacksmiths worked each shift: knives, hooks, hinges, staples, lamp parts. Everything according to the blueprints, everything to standard. The assembly shop, 10 people, lamps, 20 a day. Each one inspected, each one left to burn for 24 hours before sale. Each one registered with a serial number. The ticking from the clock workshop upstairs. Celestina and her apprentice. Lily's boys were running around town with orders. Ha-Yin had left in a wagon to gather herbs. Maggie was taking orders at the tavern. Sarah stood at the gate. A typical day. A work day. But the first day when all of this was protected by law. By noon, Caspian Voigt arrived, with papers. The governor was proposing an expansion, a branch in the neighboring town of Ravenhall, a northern town, closer to the border with the creatures of the Rift. The garrison there is 3 times larger than in Kronheim, and there's a shortage of equipment. The guilds are selling gear at double the price because they know there's nowhere to go at the border. A royal order for 500 lamps for the northern fortresses, 300 potions a month for the wounded, 100 knives for the garrison, and 20 prosthetics for veterans of the border guard. 20 prosthetics. Daniel looked at that number. 20 people without arms or legs or fingers. 20 heralds. 20 SARs. He said yes. Caspian nodded, left the papers, left. Daniel stood in his office over a map of Valerum, a large map. Ha-Yin found it at an old cartographer's for 3 silver coins. Kronheim in the center, Ravenhall to the north. Between them, 3 cities, 4 villages, mines, farms, roads, rivers. The ether veins were marked in blue. They stretched across the entire continent like veins. He saw a network, not a factory, a network. Production in Kronheim, a branch in Ravenhall, another one in a year, in the west, then in the south. Maggie's trading houses in every city, Heinz suppliers in the mountains and valleys. Training halls in every branch. Evening classes. Apprentices who learn in 3 months instead of 3 years. Masters who don't hoard knowledge but pass it on. Things that serve people, not the other way around. He knew what would happen next. The guilds wouldn't disappear. They would adapt. They would start copying his methods. They'll lower prices. They'll improve quality. Some masters from the guilds will leave to join him. Others will stay and learn. Competition, not destruction. He didn't want to destroy the guilds. He wanted to make them work. Master Grave said at the trial that Daniel didn't understand what he had unleashed. But Daniel understood. He had unleashed competition, the most dangerous weapon in the world for those accustomed to being the only ones. In the evening, the workshop fell silent. The workers had left. The blacksmith Johann was the last to leave. He wished everyone good night. The door closed. The guard took up his post on the roof. Daniel sat alone in his office. Albrecht Ven's notebook lay on the table. Next to it was a scroll containing the patent. Beside that was a drawing of tomorrow's project, a watermill with an adjustable transmission for the village of Holmwood. Morgan had written that it was difficult for them to grind grain by hand. The millstone was old and heavy. 2 people took turns turning the handle. Daniel already saw the solution. The river was nearby. The current is strong. A water wheel, a gear transmission, adjustable speed. The millstone turns on its own. The 2 men who used to turn the handle can now gather herbs, repair roofs, or simply sit and drink tea. He opened Ven's notebook to the last page. He reread it. If you're reading this, don't repeat my mistake. Don't try to convince the masters. Teach the apprentices. 300 years separate them. 300 years separate 2 people from 2 different worlds who saw the same thing. That things should serve people, and that knowledge should not be a prison. Then lost. He was killed by his own people. His knowledge was locked away. His name was forgotten. But before he died, he managed to do one thing. Plant a marker in the ether veins, a call, which 300 years later found an engineer in Ohio a second before a truck smashed him into the sidewalk. Then didn't choose the strong. He didn't choose the smart. He didn't choose the kind-hearted. He chose a man for whom maintainability is more important than beauty. A man who spent 6 years designing washing machines so that every part could be removed with just 4 screws. Because such a man cannot walk past a broken world. Daniel took out a blank notebook. He opened it to the first page. He wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I've either left or didn't make it in time. Here's what I've realized over the past year. Things should serve people, not the other way around. Knowledge that's hidden from people ceases to be knowledge and becomes a weapon. Don't teach the masters. Teach those whom the masters have cast out." He wrote down potion recipes, all 4 types, with proportions, with temperatures, with the duration of each stage. Lamp blueprints, with dimensions, with tolerances, with a description of materials. A conveyor diagram, 6 operations. How to break down the process. How to control quality. How to train a new worker in 2 days. Prosthetics. Arm. Leg. Every detail. Every dimension. Every principle. How to take measurements. How to fit a sleeve. How to make a spring-loaded foot. Celestina's watch. She herself didn't know he was writing down her method, but he watched and memorized. the memory of his hands. Saw it once and remembered it forever. He wasn't writing all this down for himself, for those who would come after him. If something happened to him, the notebook would remain, and someone would find it, just as he had found Ven's notebook. He wrote for 3 hours, until midnight. His fingers ached, his temples throbbed, a quiet ringing in his head, familiar, the price for using his ability. He finished the last page, closed the notebook, set down his quill, stood up, left the study, went down to the first floor. The workshop was asleep, quiet, dark. Only the lamps were lit on the walls, his lamps, casting a warm, even light. He walked past the alchemy workshop, past the shelves of potions, each vial labeled with a number, the craftsman's name, and the date. Emma's hand, her handwriting, small and neat. She wrote on every label herself. She didn't trust anyone else. Past the forge, hammers lined up on the wall. The anvil had cooled, the smell of iron and coal. On the wall, a blueprint for a new butcher's knife, an order from Olaf, the 3rd this year. Not because the old ones had broken, because he had a new apprentice, and the apprentice needed a tool. Past the assembly shop, 30 lamps in a row on the shelf, finished, tested, waiting for morning, waiting for Lily's boys who'll deliver them to their addresses. Past the clock workshop upstairs, on Celestina's table lie gears, small, precise, glistening in the lamplight. Next to them is the case for a future striking clock, unfinished. Celestina has been working on it for a week now. She says the hammer must strike cleanly, not just bang, it must chime. She's remade it 4 times. The 5th version lay on the table. Daniel touched it. Brass, pure, well cast. The hammer was machined to perfection. Celestina had found her craft, just as Emma had found hers, just as Sarah had, just as Haun had, just as Maggie had, just as Lily had. Each of them had come to him broken, cast out, abandoned, lost, and each had found here not just a job, a home. He went downstairs and stepped out onto the street. Kronheim at night, quiet. The stars were large and bright. The moon was nearly full. The street lights were on, old ones, guild lights, a dim greenish glow, flickering, uneven. But other lights were burning in the windows of the houses in the lower city. Warm, steady, golden. His lights. Dozens of windows, dozens of lamps. He stood on the street and counted. 112. 112 windows with his lamps burning inside. 112 families having dinner tonight by the warm light, seeing each other's faces, reading fairy tales to their children, mending clothes without squinting. 112 bulbs that would burn for another 5 weeks and then be replaced for 3 kopecks. A year ago, he was an engineer at a factory in Ohio. He designed washing machines so they could be repaired in 15 minutes. He argued with managers who wanted to solder the casing shut so the customer couldn't open it themselves and take it to a repair shop. He wrote memos that no one read. He went to meetings where they explained to him that profitability was more important than serviceability. And that seemed important to him. Small, but important. A lone nerd's crusade against corporate greed. And then the truck. The sidewalk. Light. And sawdust. And a world where the same disease exists, only without corporations. With guilds. With magic. With ether veins. But the essence is the same. People who make things not for people, but for profit. And other people who pay for it with their health, their time, and their lives. He could go back. He could feel it. A faint call somewhere inside. Like the sound of a tuning fork on the verge of audibility. The Vienna anchor. A thread between worlds. As long as the world hadn't grown accustomed to him, it held. Thinner with each passing day. Quieter with each passing day. But it was still there. He could pull on it right now and leave. Go home. To Ohio. To his apartment in Dayton. To the wrench. To the dumplings. To the washing machines. To the memos that no one reads. To a life where he was alone. A good engineer. An honest man. Lonely. Without a family. without a cat now, without any purpose other than that a part must be removed with 4 screws. He stood on the street in Kronheim at night and listened to the thread. It rang, quietly, thinner than yesterday, thinner than a week ago. Soon it would fall silent, and the anchor would become permanent, and the choice will be made. Not by him, by time. If he wants to leave, it's now. The last few days, maybe the last few hours. He thought of Maggie, who carries a basket of bread halfway across town every morning. Of Emma, who increased the potion's effectiveness from 15% to 75%, and who, in a year, will raise it to 100%. Of Sarah, who stands at his gate and to whom he gave not 1 hand, but 3. About Ha-un, who is sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3 years because she has a business in her own name. About Lily, who is learning to read and who, in a year, will read the scroll on her own. About Celestine, who is making a chiming clock because, for the first time in her life, someone expects work from her rather than a smile. About Harold, who is climbing the stairs. About old Ingrid, who sees her granddaughter's face. About Anna the laundress, whose hands no longer ache. About Olaf the butcher, whose knife never gets dull. 200 people who stood beside him in the square. 40 people who come to the workshop every morning. Dozens of apprentices who secretly attend his classes. Hundreds of clients in the ledger, with names, with stories, with faces. The string rang out. He closed his eyes, he listened. A quiet ringing, distant, like a bell beyond the horizon. He could pull the trigger, right now, and a second later he'd be lying on a sidewalk in Ohio, or in a hospital, or nowhere at all. He opened his eyes, looked at the windows, at the warm lights, at the 112 bulbs. The wire was ringing. He didn't pull it. He stood there for another minute. Then he turned and walked back to the workshop. Lily was sitting by the door. She hadn't been sleeping. She was waiting. Her bare feet tucked under her, her shoulders wrapped in a blanket she'd pulled off the bed. She asked where he'd been. He said nowhere. He was breathing. She said that tomorrow morning the first shipment would arrive from the new farmer in the valley. Ha-un had negotiated triple the usual volume, and that Olaf was asking for 3 more knives for the new apprentice. And that Harold had come by that afternoon and said he'd climbed the stairs without stopping. 12 steps, without a cane. And that Emma had asked to pass on that the new batch of potent potion was ready. And that Celestina had broken the clock's hammer for the 5th time and was cursing so loudly that the guard on the roof could hear her. And that the boys had found a new route through the southern quarter that was 10 minutes shorter than the old one. And that Anna, the laundress, had brought a pie, with apples. It's in the kitchen, still warm. Daniel listened. Lily spoke quickly and incoherently, swallowing her words and mixing up the order. A 12-year-old girl who, a year ago, had been stealing bread through a window and sleeping behind the trash cans. And now she knew everything about every order and every delivery and every customer and every pie. She fell silent. She looked at him. Then she asked quietly, "He won't go anywhere, will he?" Daniel looked at her small face in the moonlight, at eyes that had already seen too much for a 12-year-old, at hands clutching the edge of the blanket. She was afraid. She was always afraid. That the adults would leave, that it would all end, that she'd wake up in the morning and the factory would be empty and she'd be alone on the street again. 3 years on the street had taught her to be afraid. A year with Daniel hadn't cured that fear. But maybe 2 years would, or 3, or 10. He said he wasn't going anywhere. She looked at him. Then she nodded. She stood up. She shook out the blanket. She said that in that case he needed to eat, because he hadn't eaten again, and that Anna's pie was getting cold. And she went to the kitchen. The thread between the worlds hummed, quieter than a minute ago, quieter than when he was standing on the street. It was growing quieter, with every second, with every step back. Soon it would fall silent entirely, and the anchor would become permanent, and he would stay, forever. An engineer from Ohio in a world where magic flows through the veins like ore, where guilds had people by the throat for 300 years, where boys stole bread, old women went blind in the dark, and veterans walked on wooden legs and paid for their pain with years of their lives. A world where everything had been done wrong, and where one man with a knife and a measuring spoon and the ability to see things as they really were could change it. Not in a year, not in 2, maybe in 10, maybe in 20, but he could. He walked into the kitchen. Lily was standing on tiptoe, cutting the pie with the knife he'd made for Maggie. Lightweight, a thin blade, a handle fitted for a small hand. The knife sliced through the pie like butter. Lily placed a slice on a plate. She set it in front of him. Daniel was eating apple pie at midnight in the factory he'd built in a world he'd stumbled into by accident. And the pie was good. Warm, sweet, with cinnamon. He finished it, wiped his hands, stood up, went into the study, sat down at the desk. He opened a blank sheet of paper and began to sketch. A water mill with an adjustable transmission for the village of Homewood, because Morgan had said that it was hard for them to grind grain by hand. And Daniel Carter, whenever he heard that someone was having a hard time, would sit down and sketch. The thread fell silent. He didn't notice when, somewhere between the second slice of pie and the third gear drawing. Quietly, without a goodbye, without drama, the anchor settled into place, forever. And Daniel kept drawing, because that was his craft, the only one he knew, and the only one that was needed.